Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a topic that has absolutely shaped the very foundation of human history. We are going to explore the deeply intertwined roots of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Far too often, we just focus on what divides these three monumental faiths. But as we'll see today, they actually share an incredible theological heritage, a common cast of prophetic messengers, and, amazingly enough, periods of profound peaceful coexistence. So here's our roadmap for today. First, the Abrahamic family tree. Second, prophets of one God. Third, the era of convivencia. And finally, the spirit of Cordoba. Let's jump right in. Part 1. The Abrahamic family tree. Tracing the common soil. To truly grasp the relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we really have to look back to the ancient Near East. Now, what's genuinely fascinating here is that, despite the real differences that developed over centuries, their foundational architecture sprouted from the exact same spiritual soil. All three are strictly monotheistic. They believe in one eternal, all-powerful creator. They all trace their spiritual and, in some cases, biological lineage right back to the patriarch Abraham. They're all religions of the book, believing God communicates through written scriptures and intercessory spiritual beings like angels. And they all deeply connect devotion to God with strict ethical obligations, variations of the golden rule. And, well, these shared abstract beliefs translate directly into physical everyday practices that look incredibly alike across all three traditions. Whether it's approaching a personable God through daily prayer or a massive emphasis on charity to help the poor, the day-to-day spiritual life is highly comparable. Just look at the tradition of fasting, for example. Jews observe Yom Kippur, Christians observe Lent, and Muslims observe Ramadan. Sure, the details and durations vary, but the core human practice of spiritual discipline through fasting, that is a deeply shared heritage. Where they diverge, however, is in how they actually conceptualize that one God. Judaism and Islam share a belief in unitary monotheism, meaning God is strictly a one, undivided entity. In Islam, this absolute oneness is known as Tawheed. On the flip side, Christianity conceptualizes the one God as a triune monotheism. That's a single Godhead consisting of three distinct persons: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, moving to part 2, prophets of one God, messengers of the divine. Because think about it, God in these traditions doesn't just exist in a vacuum. He communicates through a shared cast of messengers. It's brilliant when you realize that the exact same historical figures revered in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are absolutely central to the Quran. Abraham is Ibrahim, the friend of God. Moses is Musa, the one who spoke with God. And actually, fun fact, he's the most frequently named prophet in the entire Quran. And this bursts a really common myth. Jesus, known as Isa, is highly revered in Islam as a prophet and the Messiah, holding the very unique title of Spirit of God. The Quran explicitly cements this connection in chapter 3, verse 84. It clearly states that Muslims believe in what was revealed to Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and the prophets, adding, "We make no distinction between one and another among them." The theological stance here is powerful. It says all these biblical figures were legitimate messengers, delivering the exact same unified message of monotheism. Which brings us to part 3, the era of convivencia, the Spanish crucible. So, we've talked about abstract theology and ancient prophets. But how does this actually play out in the real world? What happens when these three worldviews, with all their profound similarities and their stark differences, are literally forced to share the same cities, the same markets, and the same government? Well, historians use a very specific word for this: convivencia. It's a Spanish noun that translates simply to living with the other. Coined by 20th century scholars, it perfectly describes the incredibly unique era of cultural cross-pollination and relative interreligious coexistence in Islamic Spain, which was known as Al-Andalus. And just to put that into perspective, this wasn't just some brief, fleeting moment in history. It began way back in 711 CE, when Muslim forces arrived in the Iberian Peninsula. It reached an incredible flourishing zenith around 929 CE with the proclamation of the Caliphate of Cordoba. And it officially ended centuries later in 1492 with the Christian Reconquista, the fall of Granada, and the tragic expulsion of the Jews from Spain. The term convivencia was actually popularized by the Spanish historian Americo Castro back in 1948, and he viewed this era very optimistically. He described it as a stabilized pluralism where dialogues enriched everyone. He was essentially pointing to a kind of idyllic utopia of religious harmony and integration that really stood in stark contrast to the rest of medieval Europe. But here's the crucial point. Modern historians heavily debate this. It definitely wasn't a black and white utopia. Contrasting that romanticized Golden Age perspective, more recent scholars view it as an uncomfortable necessity. They point out, rightly so, that this wasn't a modern secular democracy. Society had strict social boundaries. Christians and Jews were considered dhimmis, or protected peoples, but they had to pay a special tax called the jizya, and they faced certain legal restrictions. So it was a complex, sometimes tense, yet very functioning society. And finally, part 4, the spirit of Cordoba, a flourishing of culture. Because regardless of whether you view it as a utopia or a pragmatic necessity, the results of this cohabitation are just undeniable. Despite the social boundaries we just mentioned, this period is unanimously considered the Golden Age of Judaism. When you compare it to the heavy persecution Jews faced under previous Visigothic rulers or in the rest of medieval Christian Europe, Al-Andalus offered unparalleled prosperity. Jews were free to practice their religion, they ran their own legal systems, and they were heavily involved in the highest levels of government and trade. Take Hasdai ibn Shaprut, for example. He was a brilliant Jewish physician who essentially served as the top diplomat and advisor to the Muslim caliph. And this intellectual cross-pollination produced absolute giants of philosophy. Think about figures like Maimonides, the Jewish theologian, and Averroes, the Muslim scholar. They lived in the exact same era, walking the same streets of Cordoba. They shared a common intellectual vocabulary, blending the Arabic language with ancient Greek philosophy, effectively creating a massive bridge of knowledge between the faiths. Let's move to how this builds into something even larger. This collaboration sparked a massive scientific awakening. Mathematicians here advanced algebra and trigonometry. Astronomers refined the astrolabe for navigation. They built early medical schools, pioneered pharmacology, and revolutionized architecture with innovations like the gorgeous horseshoe arch. But perhaps most importantly, their massive translation movement preserved ancient Greek and Roman texts. This work literally laid the direct groundwork for the European Renaissance. 8. That is the number of centuries that this complex interaction lasted on the Iberian Peninsula. 800 years. 800 years of trading, translating, debating, and living side by side. It is absolute proof that religious differences, even when they cause friction or tension, can ultimately be a source of profound, world-changing cultural enrichment rather than just perpetual conflict. Which leaves us with this final thought. We started with the shared theological DNA of these three great faiths, and we saw how they eventually coexisted to build one of the brightest periods of human history. So, if the spirit of Cordoba could bridge differences and create such brilliance in the Middle Ages, what can its legacy teach our modern, divided world today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.